Have you ever felt the soft tremble of a forgotten mind calling your name from centuries away? Tonight, we will live a life in medieval minds, where the silent fractures of the human spirit were mistaken for omens, curses, and wandering souls, where ordinary gestures hid quiet storms no one dared name, and where the heart of suffering beat beneath cloaks of devotion and duty, unseen yet eternal. Through shadows of parchment halls and frostbitten fields, we will walk among the misunderstood, the unseen, the fragile souls who carried their battles alone. But before we begin this journey, don't forget to subscribe this channel and comment name of your hometown. I would love to hear from which part of world you guys are joining this journey. Leave your whispers in the comments. And if this story speaks to you, light a candle with a like. The medieval world unfolds before us like a dim vellum page, touched by candlelight edges, curled ink thinning a realm, where the mind's fractures were tucked beneath veils of faith, routine, and ritual, invisible yet breathing beneath. Every gesture of daily life shaping fates without a name. In this slow dawn, we step into villages wrapped in mist, where the toll of iron bells mingles with the low hum of fields waking under cold suns. Where stone chapels echo the muted footsteps of souls seeking absolution for wounds they could not describe. The air carries the scent of damp hay, wood smoke, and mortality. A quiet reminder of how fragile existence was, how tightly survival clung to labor, discipline, and obedience, leaving little room to question suffering that came from within. And in this silence, the behaviors we might now trace to the trembling roots of mental illness lived unnoticed or misunderstood, woven into normal patterns of life, accepted as quirks, burdens, or divine trials. A man pacing endlessly at dawn, always circling the same frost-itched patch of land, was simply said to be communing with God or preparing for toil, when in truth his sleepless mind battled unseen terrors, his restless body trying to escape thoughts that gnawed like unseen wolves beneath the ribs. A woman withdrawing into quiet corners, staring at drifting dust as if it held a secret, was called contemplative. Pious, touched by serenity, when in truth her world slipped into slow melancholy, her identity thinning like worn parchment. A young apprentice, unable to focus on simple tasks, losing himself in spirals of confusion and forgotten tools, was labeled lazy, careless, a burden to the workshop, when in truth his thoughts fractured into scattered streams. He could not grasp, drifting like torn feathers on winter wind. And still life pressed on, because survival demanded movement, demanded repetition, demanded the suppression of questions no one had words to frame. Days unfolded in predictable rhythms, steady as mill wheels turning over water thick with mud. Yet beneath these routines lay deep human fragility, disguised as duty or devotion. Some found solace in constant fasting, believing hunger could purify storms within, unaware that the relentless emptiness was not holy fire but the shadow of despair taking root. Others wandered into forests at dawn, seeking solitude, claiming visions or guiding voices, when their minds longed not for prophecy but relief from noise, expectation, and the crushing weight of village eyes. Even the village fool, a figure half pitied, half mocked, often carried the heavy chains of cognitive suffering, yet his odd gestures and mismatched laughter were accepted as part of the world's natural order. And through this landscape of muted struggle, the church loomed as both refuge and mirror, offering explanations carved from faith rather than understanding. Those plagued by intrusive thoughts whispered prayers to saints, believing themselves sinful, cursed, or weak, while night terrors were blamed on demons slipping beneath thatched roofs or spirits pressing cold fingers against the chest. And in every small medieval village, these silent storms lived quietly in daily rituals, the woman endlessly washing the same wooden cup, scrubbing until her knuckles cracked, her mind trapped in an anxious loop she could not escape. The shepherd who avoided gatherings, standing always at the farthest edge of crowds, heart clenched beneath layers of simple wool. The baker who muttered to himself over flour and fire, stitching fractured thoughts through every kneaded loaf. None of these behaviors carried the language we now have. No words like melancholy, anxiety, or delusion. No distinctions between suffering of the flesh and suffering of the mind. Instead, such signs dissolved into the rhythm of life itself, interpreted as temperament, fate, divine testing, or the mysterious whims of a world understood through symbols rather than science. And as we walk deeper into this era, stepping carefully through memories coated in dust and frost, the truth grows clearer. The medieval mind did not lack pain, only the vocabulary to name it, and in this absence, ordinary behavior became the refuge for extraordinary suffering, hidden in plain sight. Preserved across centuries like faint ink refusing to fade from an ancient manuscript. The path leads us deeper past the low stone walls where moss clings like old memory into the marrow of medieval life, where ordinary gestures carried the weight of unspoken torment and where minds frayed quietly beneath the fabric of routine. Here, in the slow pulse of village existence, sorrow hid behind frost-bitten mornings and smoke-stained evenings, shaping lives without ever being recognized as illness. Men rose before dawn with trembling hands, the cold biting at their skin, but the real chill came from within, from thoughts that swirled like ravens around a dying harvest. These were men who drifted into silence during feasts, who stared at candles as if the flame offered answers, who walked home through moonlit paths, muttering prayers stitched together from fear and confusion. Their withdrawn steps were labeled discipline or modesty, never the heaviness of a mind sinking beneath the weight of unspoken despair. Women, too, carried burdens unseen. Those who could not stop arranging and rearranging dried herbs on wooden shelves, insisting on precise patterns, were praised for diligence, yet their hearts raced with unseen compulsions, their spirits trapped in rituals that soothed and suffocated them at once. The woman who collected stray feathers, convinced they protected her from misfortune, was indulged as charmingly odd, though her fear of unseen calamity roared like a silent storm inside her chest. The girl who refused to eat more than crumbs, claiming purity, holiness, and self-denial, wasted away in quiet corners, and her fading body became a spectacle of devotion rather than a sign of collapsing inner balance. In monasteries, where quiet was revered as sacred, the signs grew even more hidden. A monk who spent hours tracing the same line across parchment, unable to move to the next, was admired for patience. When his thoughts were tangled, fogged, dissolving into fragments he fought to gather. Another who walked the cloister path in endless circles, lips moving, breath uneven, was believed to be deep in contemplation. Though each step was an attempt to escape a mind echoing with relentless doubts that scraped like cold iron against bone. And yet, medieval society absorbed these struggles as natural threads in the tapestry of life, never unsettling the order, never prompting inquiry. Their world was ruled by seasons, plagues, harvests, wars, faith, and fate, leaving little room to examine the private storms that gnawed at the spirit. A knight who froze in battle, unable to advance, though his armor gleamed beneath the sun, carried the shame of cowardice, while his trembling legs and pounding heart reflected a mind scarred by old horror's images burned into memory that returned with every clang of metal. A mother who cried at night for reasons she could not explain blamed sin, cursed stars, or the devil's whisper. Yet the truth was gentler, sadder, a slow erosion of her emotional world that no one had tools to mend. The boy who wandered away from lessons, staring at shifting light on stone floors, hands fidgeting, thoughts drifting far from the classroom, was beaten for disobedience, though his mind simply moved in currents different from those around him. Another who lashed out in sudden bursts of anger or panic was scolded for wickedness, though beneath his clenched fists lay fear he could not voice. And still, life flowed on, smooth as river water across polished stones, carrying these unnoticed pains into adulthood, into old age, into the earth itself. Daily life offered no refuge, only tasks spinning wool, grinding grain, mending nets, tending livestock, and those who faltered were seen as weak or cursed rather than wounded. Even village healers, with their bundles of herbs and whispered prayers, viewed the mind as a battleground for spirits rather than a fragile landscape shaped by emotion, memory, and imbalance. Thus, the community responded with rituals, holy water sprinkled on trembling foreheads, candles lit for the sleepless, charms hung above doors for those who wandered aimlessly through nights heavy with dread. These gestures, though offered in compassion, did little to soften the invisible fractures widening beneath the surface. And so, medieval life became a sanctuary for misunderstood suffering, a world where strange quirks blended seamlessly into routine, where the signs of mental illness were camouflaged by faith, fear, tradition, and survival, preserved across generations like faint ink beneath centuries of dust, waiting for someone far in the future to finally read the truth within their silence. The road bends toward the heart of medieval life, where the mind's quiet unraveling lingered beneath the rhythm of bells, beneath the rustle of wool cloaks, brushed by winter wind beneath the soft thud of wooden buckets lowered into deep stone wells. Here, in the gentle hush of ordinary days, signs of internal fracture blended into accepted customs, unnoticed by those who lived beside them. A man who drifted through mornings with vacant eyes, forgetting names, forgetting paths he had traveled since childhood, was said to be lost in thought, or touched by melancholy humors, or weakened by age, though his wandering memory was not an ailment of the body but the soft dimming of cognition, a fading spark hidden beneath routine. Villagers greeted him kindly, guiding him home with patient hands, unaware that his identity frayed like unraveling thread, each forgotten detail a small surrender. And as his days thinned, he clung to familiar tasks, stacking firewood, smoothing straw, folding cloths to anchor the pieces of himself that slipped like dust between his fingers. Nearby, a woman stirred pots over open flames, though her mind spun in circles too tight to escape. She counted each ingredient again and again, stirred in exact repetitions, whispered silent numbers to steady herself. Her neighbors praised her carefulness, believing precision marked skill, unaware that every gesture came from panic, from a compulsion that wrapped around her ribs like invisible vines. She feared catastrophe in every misplaced grain of salt, every fraction of imbalance, every deviation from routines carved into her bones. She lived in quiet dread, her breaths shallow, her nights sleepless, her prayers long and trembling. And still she worked, because work was the one place where the world made sense, where repetition offered fragile refuge. In the marketplace, where scents of tallow, leather, dried berries, and damp earth mingled in chaos, a young merchant paced behind his stall, fingers tapping wooden planks, heart racing without cause. He avoided meeting eyes, flinched at sudden movement, scanned crowds as though danger lurked in every shifting cloak. Those around him simply called him nervous, shy, overly cautious, unaware that his chest burned with relentless anxiety, fear rising like frost inside a sealed window. His hands shook as he weighed coins, his tongue stumbled over simple words, and he often fled to alleys for air, leaning against stone walls as if the earth itself could steady him. Yet his behavior never provoked concern, for in a world shaped by war, famine, and plague, fear was expected, even admired. The subtler layers of his suffering dissolved into the haze of everyday struggle. On distant fields, farmers followed repetitive patterns that masked deeper wounds. One man plowed the same strip of land twice, then thrice, wandering in looping paths as though caught in a trance. Villagers joked that he loved his work too much, unaware that his perception flickered, that his thoughts drifted in and out like candlelight in wind. The world blurred around him, voices muffled, sounds stretched and distorted. At times, he whispered to shadows only he could see. Yet these murmurs slipped into the vast chorus of field labor, the grunt of oxen, the creak of wood, the sigh of grass becoming indistinguishable from the world's natural noise. What might now be recognized as the early waves of psychosis was then absorbed into the land's silence, hidden beneath dirt-stained fingers and sun-chapped skin. In the castle's colder halls, servants moved with mechanical precision, some fueled by anxiety that coiled like iron in their stomachs. A maid who scrubbed stone floors until her hands bled insisted the surface remained unclean. Convinced dirt clung to her no matter how fiercely she washed. The scent of lye clung to her skin for days, and though others scolded her for wasting soap, no one questioned the terror in her eyes, the way she shrank from invisible stains. She carried silent obsessions, invisible rituals, suffering masked beneath duty, her identity dissolving in the endless pursuit of impossible purity. In the same manner, an elderly steward carefully arranged scrolls and tallies. Though his thoughts slipped away mid-sentence, he misplaced objects he had counted moments earlier, forgot the purpose of his tasks, stared at wax seals without recognition. Yet his decline was seen as natural aging, rather than the cognitive unraveling now known as dementia. He carried on with forced dignity, hiding confusion beneath routines, copying numbers with trembling quills while shadows lengthened around him. Each day he lost more of himself, and each loss settled quietly into the hall's cold air, unnoticed except by the candles that flickered when he paused too long. In every corner of medieval life, these unspoken struggles curled gently into normalcy, unchallenged by a society without tools to understand them. Faith filled every gapped behavior was divine trial, demonic intrusion, imbalance of humors, or simple temperament. When a villager wandered through forests alone, speaking to the wind, no one sought treatment. Instead, they assumed he sought guidance from saints or spirits. When a widow lay in bed for weeks, staring at smoke drifting from the hearth, they assumed grief consumed her, not the consuming grip of depression. When a youth erupted in sudden anger, fists slamming wood, they blamed sin, not emotional turbulence he could not name. Mental illness lived not at the edges of society, but at its center, hidden within everyday gestures, blended so seamlessly into routine that centuries passed before its echoes were recognized for what they truly were. Here, in the medieval world, suffering moved quietly, cloaked in duty, faith, and silence, its memory preserved in small acts that still shimmer faintly beneath the dust of history. The landscape widens before us, and the medieval world breathes in slow, solemn rhythm, carrying the weight of minds unraveling beneath the quiet mask of daily life. Here, in the hush between dawn bells and the settling dusk, the signs of troubled spirits blended into customs rituals, and the relentless tide of survival, each gesture shaped by a society that did not distinguish sorrow of the flesh from sorrow of the soul. In the monasteries, where parchment glowed under amber candlelight, monks sat in long rows, quills trembling in uncertain hands, minds drifting through fog thick as cathedral incense. One monk traced letters repeatedly, unable to move past a single word, lost in cycles of obsession mistaken for devotion. Another stared at blank vellum, thoughts scattered like fallen leaves. Yet others believed he listened for divine inspiration. Their struggles dissolved into silence, masked by vows, obscured by reverence. A spinner whose breath quickened with every twist of wool was dismissed as tired or distracted, though panic tightened within her like a knot she could not undo. Her fingers trembled, her heart pounded, yet she forced calmness, afraid to reveal the storm rising behind her eyes. Another woman hummed nameless melodies to anchor herself against intrusive thoughts that scratched at her peace. But her neighbors admired her for bringing music to the cold workrooms, never sensing the desperation in each note. And yet, in these small acts, these outwardly harmless habits, the mind's fractures glimmered faintly, unnoticed by the era that housed them. Outside, in the world of peasants and ploughmen, labor concealed wounds even more deeply. The farmer who forgot entire mornings, losing hours as though swallowed by shadow, was considered merely exhausted by the demands of land and weather, though his mind drifted through dissociation, splitting from reality to escape the strain of existence. Another who lashed out without warning, swinging tools in sudden bursts of rage before collapsing into regretful silence, was feared or avoided, though his turmoil simmered beneath the surface like embers. Beneath ash, unrecognized as the echoes of trauma and inward torment, even his loved ones whispered explanations shaped by superstition-cursed blood. Divine punishment, strange humors, never daring to imagine that the battles he waged were internal, relentless, and invisible. In marketplaces, lined with rough stalls and tangled voices, merchants grappled with storms no one detected. One lost track of numbers constantly, hands shaking as he tried to count coins that blurred in his vision. They called him careless, yet he battled a troubled concentration, thoughts slipping away like water from cupped palms. Another vendor, overwhelmed by the noise, pressed hands to his ears, blinking against the sensory assault that made his world spin. Townsfolk teased him for being dramatic, unaware that every shout, every clang of metal, every shifting crowd struck him like a blow, shaking the fragile balance of his mind. And in the evenings, as lantern glows spilled onto cobblestone streets, some wandered aimlessly, unable to settle, unable to rest, pacing under moonlight as though hunted by unseen shadows. These restless souls were labeled anxious, superstitious, or overly imaginative. Yet their pacing was a quiet cry, a body searching for calm it could not find. Nights offered little mercy. Many woke gasping, trembling from terrors no one saw, hearts racing as though chased through darkness. But nightmares were blamed on demons pressing upon one's chest, shadows creeping into dreams, spirits whispering malevolence, without understanding the mind's internal storms. The medieval heart searched for supernatural answers, never realizing that fear itself could root deeply, curling into every breath, shaping every dawn. Even in noble courts, beneath banners and gold-stitched fabrics, the mind's burdens lingered. A servant who forgot commands repeatedly was punished for incompetence, though his memory faltered from overwhelming strain. A lady who isolated herself behind heavy drapes, avoiding feasts and conversation, was rumored to be prideful or afflicted by weak constitution, though sorrow clung to her like heavy velvet, pulling her deeper into isolation. She pressed rosary beads until her knuckles whitened, whispering prayers for clarity. Yet her world dulled into a haze that no scripture could lift. The nobleman who stared for long hours into the courtyard, motionless, lost in thoughts too dense to escape, was praised for contemplative nature. While inside, depression crushed him with relentless weight. And through it all, the church's interpretation shaped every perception. Pilgrimages masked desperate attempts to outrun despair. Fasting disguised self-harm as piety. Physical weakness was seen as moral failure. Emotional collapse as spiritual corruption. And in this woven tapestry of misunderstanding, every sign of mental illness existed quietly within the fabric of normal life, misread, misnamed, or ignored. Their suffering whispered beneath the clatter of horseshoes, beneath the clink of pewter cups, beneath the chants in stone chapels, lingering in gestures too small to break the world's rhythm. The medieval mind, so fragile, so exposed to hardship, carried its burdens with a solitude that echoes across centuries. And as we walk deeper into these remembered shadows, we see that what they carried alone, the world mistook for temperament, fate, or divine. Trial leaving their silent struggles etched into the dust, waiting for someone, at last, to understand. The path leads us deeper past the low stone walls, where moss clings like old memory into the marrow of medieval life, where ordinary gestures carried the weight of unspoken torment, and where minds frayed quietly beneath the fabric of routine. Here, in the slow pulse of village existence, sorrow hid behind frostbitten mornings and smoke-stained evenings, shaping lives without ever being recognized as illness. Men rose before dawn with trembling hands, the cold biting at their skin. But the real chill came from within, from thoughts that swirled like ravens around a dying harvest. These were men who drifted into silence during feasts, who stared at candles as if the flame offered answers, who walked home through moonlit paths, muttering prayers stitched together from fear and confusion. Their withdrawn steps were labeled discipline or modesty, never the heaviness of a mind sinking beneath the weight of unspoken despair. Women, too, carried burdens unseen. Those who could not stop arranging and rearranging dried herbs on wooden shelves, insisting on precise patterns, were praised for diligence, yet their hearts raced with unseen compulsions, their spirits trapped in rituals that soothed and suffocated them at once. The woman who collected stray feathers, convinced they protected her from misfortune, was indulged as charmingly odd, though her fear of unseen calamity roared like a silent storm inside her chest. The girl who refused to eat more than crumbs, claiming purity, holiness, and self-denial, wasted away in quiet corners, and her fading body became a spectacle of devotion rather than a sign of collapsing inner balance. In monasteries, where quiet was revered as sacred, the signs grew even more hidden. A monk who spent hours tracing the same line across parchment, unable to move to the next, was admired for patience. When his thoughts were tangled, fogged, dissolving into fragments he fought to gather. Another who walked the cloister path in endless circles, lips moving, breath uneven, was believed to be deep in contemplation. Though each step was an attempt to escape a mind echoing with relentless doubts that scraped like cold iron against bone. And yet, medieval society absorbed these struggles as natural threads in the tapestry of life, never unsettling the order, never prompting inquiry. Their world was ruled by seasons, plagues, harvests, wars, faith, and fate, leaving little room to examine the private storms that gnawed at the spirit. A knight who froze in battle, unable to advance, though his armor gleamed beneath the sun, carried the shame of cowardice, while his trembling legs and pounding heart reflected a mind scarred by old horror's images burned into memory that returned with every clang of metal. A mother who cried at night for reasons she could not explain blamed sin, cursed stars, or the devil's whisper. Yet the truth was gentler, sadder, a slow erosion of her emotional world that no one had tools to mend. The boy who wandered away from lessons, staring at shifting light on stone floors, hands fidgeting, thoughts drifting far from the classroom, was beaten for disobedience, though his mind simply moved in currents different from those around him. Another who lashed out in sudden bursts of anger or panic was scolded for wickedness, though beneath his clenched fists lay fear he could not voice. And still, life flowed on, smooth as river water across polished stones, carrying these unnoticed pains into adulthood, into old age, into the earth itself. Daily life offered no refuge, only tasks spinning wool, grinding grain, mending nets, tending livestock, and those who faltered were seen as weak or cursed rather than wounded. Even village healers, with their bundles of herbs and whispered prayers, viewed the mind as a battleground for spirits rather than a fragile landscape shaped by emotion, memory, and imbalance. Thus, the community responded with rituals, holy water sprinkled on trembling foreheads, candles lit for the sleepless, charms hung above doors for those who wandered aimlessly through nights heavy with dread. These gestures, though offered in compassion, did little to soften the invisible fractures widening beneath the surface. And so, medieval life became a sanctuary for misunderstood suffering, a world where strange quirks blended seamlessly into routine, where the signs of mental illness were camouflaged by faith, fear, tradition, and survival, preserved across generations like faint ink beneath centuries of dust, waiting for someone far in the future to finally read the truth within their silence. The world grows quieter now as we reach the final bend in this long-forgotten road, where the echoes of medieval minds drift like faint candle smoke rising toward rafters darkened by centuries. Here, in the soft twilight between memory and oblivion, the final signs of hidden suffering emerge, subtle as dust motes swirling in narrow sunbeams that slip through shuttered windows. These were the souls whose internal worlds trembled beneath the weight of expectations, rituals, superstitions, and the relentless press of survival. In the dim corners of crowded taverns, a man who drank not for revelry but for escape raised his mug with shaking hands, hoping ale might silence the relentless noise inside his head. To others he was merry, foolish, indulgent, yet the truth lay heavy behind his eyes, where guilt fluttered like a trapped bird. His laughter came too quickly, his joy too loud, masking a despair that seeped into him like winter chill. People described him as soulful, a man with a heart too full for the world. Yet the truth was that he sang to steady himself, to anchor his mind against the sudden bursts of fear that flooded him when silence grew too long. And each night, when applause faded, he curled beneath wool blankets, whispering reassurances to himself, trying to hold together the fragile pieces of his identity. Further along dusty roads, a hunter walked alone with a stillness that unsettled villagers. He rarely spoke, rarely met eyes, rarely celebrated a good hunt. They called him fiercely independent, but isolation was not a choice. Crowds overwhelmed him, voices disoriented him. He sensed emotion too strongly, like a tide pulling him under. So he fled into forests where the world's noise softened, where trees offered solace, where he could breathe without drowning in other people's feelings. His solitude, admired by some, was simply refuge from overstimulation he could not name, the paths of their entire lives. A child who rocked back and forth to soothe himself was told to sit still, his parents believing discipline could tame what was never rebellion. They had no words for sensory sensitivity, no understanding of neurodivergence, no awareness that these little ones experienced the world through sharper colors, louder sounds, heavier textures. Instead, their behaviors folded into daily life. Misunderstood but tolerated, patterns repeated until adulthood hardened them into habits mistaken for temperament. In castle courts, beneath banners and flickering torches, nobles concealed their mental wounds behind gilded rituals. A king's advisor, overwhelmed by responsibility, grew paranoid in silence, convinced betrayal lurked in every shadow. His unease was attributed to wisdom, caution, loyalty, though fear sharpened his thoughts like glass. A noblewoman who stayed awake through endless nights, mind racing with worries she could not quiet, was praised for vigilance, though sleeplessness consumed her strength, eroding her spirit grain by grain. And the aging knight who sat alone polishing armor long after battles past was said to be dedicated. Nostalgic, disciplined, yet his hands trembled as he worked, memories of violent clashes returning uninvited, looping endlessly in his mind. He relived sound steel clashing, men crying out, horses screaming long after the battlefield fell silent. Then, it was simply called being seasoned. And still, the medieval world moved, carried by the slow cycles of nature. The seasons turned, snow fell on thatched roofs, rivers froze, then thawed, children grew, elders faded. And across these turns of life, invisible suffering persisted in silence, disguised as piety, humility, diligence, sin, or fate. Without language to untangle the mind's knots, people interpreted experience through the narrow windows of their world. Strange behaviors meant divine testing. Sudden fear meant spirits nearby. Melancholy meant imbalance of humors. Mood swings meant curses. Withdrawal meant reverence. Even the gentlest souls interpreted their own distress as moral failure. Believing sorrow revealed weakness. Believing intrusive thoughts proved corruption. Believing anxiety showed insufficient faith. And so they hid their struggles behind devotion, chores, traditions, and rituals. They entered churches seeking forgiveness for feelings that were never sins. They buried confusion under work until exhaustion became comfort. These were not acts of ignorance. They were acts of survival. In the medieval world, the mind was a mystery wrapped in faith and fear. And those who suffered did so quietly, tenderly, unknowingly, leaving behind faint relics of inner battles carved into habits, stories, and generations. Now, as we step away from this forgotten landscape, we recognize their humanity more clearly than they ever could. Their silence teaches us how far we have journeyed and how much of them still lives within us, carried through time like soft ash on the wind, drifting into our understanding. In their ordinary behaviors, we see extraordinary resilience, a testament to what the human spirit endures even when unseen. The medieval mind, misunderstood yet deeply human, whispers its final truth. Suffering has always walked beside us, and so our journey through medieval signs of hidden mental illness comes to an end. But history is never silent. It whispers to those who listen, and it waits for those who dare to return. In our next voyage, we will step into another chapter carved into the stones of time. Until then, may the echoes of the past follow you into your dreams, and may you wake ready for the next legend. Good night.